it's Luke. What's going on? We're here for our course breakdown for the 2022 Sony Open. Last week was an absolute shootout over on Maui between Cam Smith and Jon Rahm. Just some outstanding golf all around. We even had guys like Matt Jones making an absolute charge over the weekend. I mean, the guy shot 23 under on Saturday and Sunday and still didn't win the event. That's just how good the entertainment was last week. And on top of it being just a great show overall, we also ended up taking home quite a nice little bit of profit last week. So I'm going to go ahead and just show you guys what we ended up doing last week. DFS with our single entry lineup was absolute fire last week. And primarily that started with our course analysis. We were spot on with our projections for last week, whether it was the course playing longer than usual with some of the weather, the fact that it was a little bit more soft, and of course, the fact that some of the undulation was really going to cause havoc for some of those process-oriented players like a Bryson DeChambeau. We saw some of the more creative guys, a Cam Smith, somebody who's an around the green specialist, a Jon Rahm who's also known for his ability to get up and down, able to take care of a lot of that complexity that was added to the course. So a little bit of a pat on the back right there. Great week of analysis, and we're going to look to build on that this time around with Waialae Country Club over on Oahu. We are in the second leg of this Hawaii swing, and for this video, we're going to get you guys prepared for everything you guys need to know for this week's event. We're going to start off with our course key details. We're going to go via hole by hole over a complete breakdown of this venue. We're going to talk about some key stats for our player analysis if you guys are looking at the betting board or the DFS side. And of course, we'll wrap it up with our comp courses for this week. Some of the venues around the PGA Tour that look very similar to what we'll be seeing this week and that you can use for some of your analysis as well. So with that being said, let's hop right into it. Historic Waialae Country Club has been a PGA Tour stop since 1965, and we've been there all but 1 year. So one of the most played golf courses that we see year in and year out, which means we have tons of data to look at when trying to break this thing down. It is situated on the island of Oahu, Hawaii, and because we've seen it so much, this is a place that we pretty much know how it's going to play every single year. The only X factor that comes into play is the weather at times. And as of right now, we are looking at very benign conditions. So we should see an absolute birdie fest and a lot of consistency from what we've seen in years past. In terms of its historical value, this golf course, again, one of the most played golf courses on the PGA Tour, but also featured in a lot of golf video games, whether it's the Nintendo 64 Waialae Country Club video game, or of course the Tiger Woods golf games from the early 2000s, where Waialae was one of the featured golf courses. That's where I became very familiar with this venue. So even though some of you out there might not think you have familiarity with this track, you most certainly have if you've played those games. In terms of some of the metrics here, we have a short golf course at just 7,044 yards. That should be expected with some of these coastal type of tracks because when the wind gets up, you can't have it at 7,500 yards. You'd be dealing with a very tough track, and this venue is designed for resort guests. This is a resort style golf course, so not a surprise there to see it coming in at that distance. Is a par 70 as well. It's a par 72 for the membership though. So rather than it having 4 par 3s, 10 par 4s, and 4 par 5s, you're looking at 2 of those par 5s turned into par 4s. Most notably hole number 1, also a hole on the backside of this track, which still keeps it a relatively easy golf course. I mean, for the resort style guests, sure, they'd like to have that extra par 5, but the par 4s that they've turned into the par 5s that they've turned into par 4s are all easily reachable. This is a Seth Rayner design back over 90 years ago, but it has gone under a ton of renovations. It was closer to 6,700 yards at its opening, now closer to almost 7,100 yards. And of course, it has gone much more difficult. In 1999, they added a lot of slope to the greens here. They were some of the flattest greens that you've probably seen in your life before that renovation. Now they at least have a little bit of intricacies to them and makes it at least a little bit more palatable for a PGA Tour event. If they had not made these greens harder to putt on, we'd be looking at a winning score close to 30 under par every year. This is still one of the easiest golf courses to make your putts on, so don't get me wrong, it's not like they made them Augusta National or anything like that, but at least a little bit closer to your tour standard. In terms of our grass type, we have Bermuda grass all over the golf course. So Bermuda grass greens that have plenty of grain. That should be expected on a coastal golf course. Anytime you get Bermuda grass, you're getting close to salt in the air, salinity, coastal type of conditions. it tends to get extremely, extremely grainy. You'll see that at Sea Island with the Seaside course. We see that at the Bermuda Championship. We saw that even last week over there at Kapalua, and I expect that once again. The fairways, the rough, also Bermuda grass, which is what we see week in and week out on the PGA Tour here. It's not anything we have to try and break down. In terms of the past champions at this event, and this is important here, we're going to see winning scores all over the place. So last year we had Kevin Na win at -21. Cam Smith won the year before that at just -11. That was a year where we saw plenty of bad weather. So there is a huge range in the scores out there. But if it is going to be very solid conditions like we expect, at least as of right now, probably looking at a winning score closer to Kevin Na's at -21. The year before Cam Smith, Matt Kuchar won at -22. Pankaj Zaire won the year before that at -17. And Justin Thomas, 6 years ago, won this event at -27, which is just absolutely ridiculous. He went out, shot a 59 on the first day, -11 for this type of track, which just shows you that it's out there, right? There are some good scores out there. It really comes down to the iron play, which we're going to go into a hole-by-hole breakdown here in a little bit, also some of our key stats. But if you have your approach play and your putting rolling here, the sky is the absolute limit. Let's talk about the field this week. We have 144 golfers, plenty of guys from the Tournament of Champions. We did have Bryson in the field, but he unfortunately withdrew a little bit early yesterday morning. In terms of the holes breakdown, we talked about it a little bit before. We have 4 par 3s with an average length of 191 yards, which makes it a little bit lower than the tour average. These par 3s are definitely scoreable. They do have plenty of bunkering, so if you're missing with your iron shots, could see a little bit of a penalty there, but for the players that are on top of their iron play, the guys we want to target anyways, shouldn't be an issue. In terms of the par 4s, we have 12 of them of an average length of 440 yards, making it one of the shorter tracks on tour, and a good amount of these holes are going to be a driver, wedge, or even a driving iron off the tee, mid-iron into these greens. Length is not going to be an issue, and that's why over the years we've seen some of these shorter hitters win this event. I mean, Kevin Na, a Matt Kuchar, even a Pankaj Zaire, not really known for their driving distance or even their accuracy off the tee for that matter, which falls into a lot of these par 4s type of scoring. That's not going to be an issue on holes of an average length of 440 yards. In terms of our par 5s, we only have 2 of them this week, so you're going to have to take care of them to get to a -25, -30 type of score, but they are all easily reachable. You can hit it into the rough in a lot of these holes and still have, maybe a long iron into them at the very most. For a lot of the longer hitters, you're going to be hitting driver off the tee and perhaps even an 8-9 iron. It's just how short some of these holes are. And because the par 5 is a dog leg, you're also able to take a lot of the distance off of them with a solid drive. So you're going to see a lot of that this week. Taking advantage of those par 5s is going to be absolutely vital. In terms of elevation, last week at Kapalua, we got the complete opposite of what we're going to get at Waialae. Over the entire golf course, we see an elevation change of a whopping 8 yards. I don't think there was a hole at Kapalua last week that had an elevation change of less than 8 yards. Every single hole seemingly went 30, 40 yards uphill. So for anybody that was playing the Tournament of Champions, might be at least a little bit of an adjustment to be made. The fairways are very narrow here, especially for a resort-style golf course. In fact, these are some of the hardest fairways to hit on tour. Last year, they were the hardest fairways to hit on all of the PGA Tour, which for a resort course is definitely unique. I mean, last week at Kapalua, we had some fairways that were 80 to 100 yards wide. Here, you're lucky to get them 20, 30 yards wide at times. I mean, it looks a lot like a US Open type of venue. The key here is that the rough is not very penal, which we'll get to here in a second. So even though players are going to be missing plenty of fairways, particularly if the wind gets up, isn't really an issue, as it would be at a lot of other golf courses. There's also a preferred shot shape at this golf course, which should be mentioned. A lot of the holes are straight up, particularly the par 4s and par 3s, but both of the par 5s are severe dog legs to the left. So people that have a natural draw shape to their golf shot should see at least a little bit of an advantage this week. And we do have 4 of those par 4s also dog legs to the left. So most of them straightforward, 12 of the holes, but 6 of them will be dog legs. So you're at least going to see a slight advantage to some of those drawers. In terms of the rough, we've already talked that they're not very penal this week. You're looking at 2 to 3 inch rough at some spots. And though Bermuda can be a little bit hard to judge, we always talk about getting flyers or shots that come out a little bit fat out of that type of rough. This is something that players are used to, right? Particularly at this point of the year, almost every golf course we've played for the last 2 months, 3 months even, has been a Bermuda grass type surface. So these players are used to judging that type of ability. So even if they're missing these fairways that are relatively small, I do not expect that to be an issue. The greens, which we've touched on slightly to this point, they are resort style greens. They're right about the tour average in terms of their size. It's 6,500 square foot per average, and they're large, but they're not the most elevated surfaces. So some of these around the green shots, getting up and down from the bunkers isn't as difficult as it would be at some of these other tougher tracks. Maybe a Players Championship, that kind of thing. We are dealing with a relatively short golf course, small fairways, similar setup, but the greens are a lot more difficult. Here you're dealing with relatively flat greens. Again, they're not elevated, so getting up and down it shouldn't be an issue for most of the field. You're also going to make a lot more putts here than you would at a lot of other golf courses. In terms of the Bermuda grass, like we mentioned before, it's extremely grainy here. You're going to get that with most of these coastal type of venues. So as a result, players that have high shots gained putting on Bermuda grass as compared to their baseline on other surfaces are going to be guys that we're taking a look at for this week. All right, now we're going to go through a hole-by-hole breakdown. On the screen, you guys can see one of my favorite tools for breaking down a golf course. This is the Pro Visualizer. This takes satellite imagery. You're able to kind of plan out your round. This was designed for professional golfers to try and break down a golf course before playing it. But of course, for us DFS players, going to be very valuable for just seeing how this golf course should play and maybe some of the decisions that these players are going to be making on a hole-by-hole basis. So let's start off with number one, which you can see over here. It is listed as a par 5, 530 yards. That is just not the case. This is going to be playing as a par 4. It is one of the 2 par 5s that was converted into a par 4 for this event. But they're going to be playing it from the up tees. So rather than it playing right around 530 yards, the scorecard yardage this week is 480 yards, which definitely makes it at least a little bit more reachable. So let's go ahead and take a look at how players are going to play this hole. So as you guys can see, we're going to expect them to get at least a little bit more yardage because the tees are pulled up. So you're likely to see them hit a drive right around here, which you can see over here would be right around a 10-yard drive, which including rollout should be about tour standard for most people in this field. You're looking at just, let's see, 178 yards in. Up here, it has you laying up because this is a par 5. But of course, with a par 4 on the scorecard, I do not expect many people to be laying up from 178 yards. So you're looking at a driver, mid-iron at the very most, if not a wedge for some of these longer type of players. This hole will be one of the tougher holes on the golf course, believe it or not, because it is a little bit longer than some of the other holes here. The green, though, relatively large. You do have a front bunker and a back bunker caddy quartering this green here, but not going to be an issue. If guys are hitting it into those bunkers, I do expect them to get up and down relatively easily. Let's move on to number 2 now, which is a little bit more of a straightforward hole. It is a par 4, 428 yards. And really here's where we're going to start to make decisions, right? So if you're going to go ahead and take driver off of the tee, you could potentially take this whole lake out of play. So let me go ahead and show you what I mean here. If we're going to be, a Bryson DeChambeau, who I wish was teeing it up this week because he would have some intriguing decisions to be made, you could very well take the whole water out of play. You can see 327-yard drive, leaves you with just a flip wedge in of 97 yards. But what I expect most players to do here is completely take this water out of play. You can see that it really starts to taper off into the fairway here. You don't have much room for air right there. So I expect most of these guys to lay up pretty far back, right? Maybe just hitting a 5-6 iron off of the tee and then hitting something like a 7-8 iron into the green. It should be a little bit safer. But of course, for some of those guys that are off the tee studs, you could very well see them taking the water out of play. Let's move on to the next hole now, which is another par 4. Also a very straightforward hole. You can see very similar setup. It's just on the other side of that lake. And you have a lot more room here, right? Rather than having that ribbon-sized fairway over here, you have a lot more room to deal with. So I expect most players to just absolutely bombs away. If you're hitting the ball right around 300 yards up here in the middle of the fairway, which I would expect most players to be in this range, dealing with just a wedge in. So that is also going to be another birdie opportunity as long as you keep your ball in play, which is going to be a little bit of a theme here during this video. You'll see there's a lot of decisions to be made. And if you're playing some smart golf and you're making your putts, you're just going to put up a low score by default. This is actually one of the harder par 3s on the golf course here at number 4. It is 205 yards. Doesn't have any front bunkering, which definitely helps out with this long type of hole. You could try and take something short into the green and roll it up to the hole, particularly if you have a front type of pin location. And of course, short shots, rather than dealing with a bunker shot, a little bit more simple of a pitch from the fairway. So that should be a relatively easy hole. Maybe not necessarily a birdie hole, but at least something that players are looking to take advantage of. Now we have another par 4. It's actually one of the longer par 4s on the golf course. Only one, and then the par 5 on the second 9 that was converted to a par 4 are longer, and it's still gonna be a relatively birdieable hole. I mean, most of it here is just there's no water in play, right? This creek that's up here, let's see how far it is off the tee. I believe it's only like 180 yards, 200 yards off the tee, right? So nobody's gonna have to worry about that. Everyone's gonna be blasting away with driver, hitting it well up into the fairway, and of course leaving themselves with pretty much just a wedge left. So it's again going to be a theme here. If players are very confident with their off the tee game, with hitting driver off of these tees, they're going to have a lot of wedges. So when I'm doing my analysis, when we go through our key stats a little bit later on, driving distance isn't going to be something I'm heavily weighing by any means, but for some of those longer players on tour, I am going to be taking an extra look at their wedge stats. Whereas some of the shorter hitters on tour, I might be taking a look at some of their mid-iron stats a little bit. So we'll talk about that, but definitely changes how you're going to want to break down these players based on their driving distance. It plays to almost a completely different golf course and skill set, so we'll talk about that a little bit later on. Here at hole number 6, 470-yard par 4. Pretty straightforward. You can see you have some fairway bunkers that will be in play. This marker is set at a 300-yard drive. So some of the longer hitters might be able to take them out of play completely. It shouldn't be an issue here. Relatively large green, only one bunker in play. Also another birdie hole. This 170-yard par 3 is the easiest par 3 on the golf course. Players will be looking to take advantage of it. Not really much to say there. It's a pretty straightforward golf hole. Tons of bunkering, which you'll see on most of the holes here at Waialae, but not anything that's going to cause these players trouble, particularly just 170 yards. I don't expect many of them to be in that situation to begin with. Now that we're at hole number 8 here, 460 yards, par 4. Very similar setup to what we see on a lot of these other holes, right? It's a dogleg left, so this is the first time you really see that heavy dogleg left here. You have a few fairway bunkers over here to the right, which shouldn't cause players any issues. I mean, they're going to try and cut off the left side, if anything, anyways. To try and make this hole a little bit shorter. And for those that are able to do so, that have that driving distance in the bag, also accurate, able to hit the left side of the fairway, you're looking at a short iron in. So another birdie opportunity. And of course, on hole number 9, another birdie opportunity, because it is one of the shortest par 5s we'll see on all of the PGA Tour. And the beauty here is that if you're one of the longer hitters on tour, not only can you take this fairway bunker out of play, you're going to have a wedge into a par 5. So you can see if you hit a 318-yard drive, you're looking at 190, maybe 200 yards at the very most. But some of these longer hitters that really, really get the ball out there, you're looking at truly a wedge. Pitching wedge, maybe a 9-iron at the very most. So a lot of people are going to make eagles on hole number 9. Now getting over to the back 9, we have our first drivable par 4. It is 350 yards, a hole that Bryson would certainly be taking a look at if he were playing in this event. But for most players, you're going to see them lay up off the tee here. You do deal with quite a few false fronts on this green because it is a shorter par 4. They at least wanted to add a little bit of defense here. So I wouldn't be surprised to see people lay up right around this 230, perhaps up to this 270 zone up here. You can see it just leaves a flip wedge in. So it should be a birdie opportunity. If players really want to go ahead and try and drive the green, which is going to be doable for at least a little bit of the field, going to have to get it out there right around 320 yards. Let's see, the front of this green here is, let's see if we can get the front of the green set up here. We can. The front of the green is 325 yards. So if you get it downwind, that kind of thing, could be an eagle hole as well. Now we're dealing with hole number 11, which is right against the coast, which makes it a little bit more difficult. You do get winds that come in, tend to change direction from time to time as well. It's also rated about 200 yards. So really here, just looking to get by with a par and move on to hole number 12, which is a huge scoring opportunity. Not only can you whale away at a driver on hole number 12, you're also going to have a wedge into this green. So because we don't have any water to the left and right, I expect most players to really push the ball down this fairway, and you're looking at less than 100 yards into this green, which should make it one of the easiest holes on this entire course. Now this par 5, I believe, is the par 5 that was switched into a par 4 just because it was only 500 yards in distance. I'll have to double check on that a little bit later on, but if I'm wrong, I'll correct myself there, but I'm 99% sure of that there. The beauty is we do have a fairway bunker over here to the right. The long hitters are going to be able to take that out of play. It's one of the few holes here that is a dog leg to the right. In fact, the only hole at this golf course that is a dog leg to the right. But you guys can see if we can get it over that fairway bunker there, which I expect most of these players to do. In fact, we could see the tee box moved up up, much like we saw in hole number 1, which would make getting to this point of the fairway even easier, which for par 4, I think would make a lot of sense. To penalize players for hitting it into that fairway bunker on a par 4 would just be a little bit too difficult in my opinion. I mean, they still want to see some scores well under par here. So I do expect to see that with the setup this week. You're going to have right around a 180-yard shot into this green, also making it, I wouldn't say a birdie hole, but something you should at least get by with a par. Now to hole 14, it is also a short par 4, no water in play. You can see players lay up, try just to hit it in this range, have something like a mid-iron into the green, or for players that want to be extremely aggressive, they could try to take it down near this fairway bunker, which it's only 308 yards to carry, but at the same time, what do you really gain from going from a 150-yard to a 122-yard shot? Not all that much, right? It's still a wedge in either hand. So I do expect most of these players to be hitting their drives right around here. Now we have hole 15, which is another short par 4. In fact, less than 400 yards. It's also a hole we could very well see people lay up on. You could see them lay up back here right around 200 yards and have another 180-yard shot in, or more than likely up here a little bit closer to 250, 260 yards, perhaps hitting a 3-wood off of the tee, and also only having a wedge into this green. So also another birdie hole, which again, you're probably getting tired of hearing that, but that's just the type of venue that this is. We don't have many long holes, not a ton of water in play, aside from maybe those first, second and third hole. You're really able to whale away with driver here. Now here at hole 16 is a relatively short par 4. Also a hole where you're not going to be dealing with that much issues, right? No issues off the tee in terms of water, not that much heavy tree lines. So also a relatively easy hole there. And now we have the infamous hole number 17, which for over here you can see the other par 3 we were talking about that was coastal. This one also right along the coastline, which makes it a little bit difficult at times. We have that V in the background up here, which is made by those palm trees, which is iconic for Waialae. This could be a birdie hole for some people. It is going to determine the golf tournament almost every single year. Somebody comes here and makes an unexpected birdie, or of course goes out there and makes an unexpected bogey. It's just that type of hole. A lot of variance involved with the type of wind that comes off of that ocean there. So got to be careful with hole number 17, but could also take advantage of it. And now finally for hole 18. Hole 18 is the par 5 on this side. It's 551 yards. It is a little bit of a beast. You might see some people have trouble reaching this green, but for anybody that has even a remote level of driving distance, getting out there right around 310 yards. Actually, yeah, so they get 310 rather than 301. You guys are going to see here, you're going to have 230 yards into the green, which of course, a little bit more realistic for a par 5. Last week at Kapalua, we had 280-yard shots into par 5s. But if the longest shot you're going to have at this golf course is 230 yards into a green, not going to cause these tour players trouble. They are more than capable of hitting those shots, and I expect to see tons of low scoring at this venue as a result. And now that we have a good idea of how this course will play, let's hop into our key stats for analysis for any of our players this week. First and foremost, we're going to be relying much more on historical form this week than we would recent form. In fact, recent form not even going to be a factor in my play this week. We haven't seen many of the golfers for 3-4 months. We saw a few of them last week at the Tournament of Champions, but relying on a one event sample size is not going to be doing us any good. So for our modeling, we're looking at our last 48 measured rounds for every player in the field with a slightly higher emphasis on the last 24 measured rounds. So we're kind of have at least a little bit of recent form in there because of the emphasis on the last 24 rounds rather than the last 48. But nothing too drastic there. In terms of our key stats, our number one stat is going to be shots gained putting on Bermuda grass, which should not be surprising to anyone. Because this is a short track, you tend to see some of the better putters on tour really excel here. You're going to have to make a ton of putts here, and because we're getting some true Bermuda grass surfaces with tons of grain, it's coastal, you're going to have to be good on Bermuda in general. There's a huge polarization on the surface. Guys that are good on Bermuda grass tend to be extremely solid putters on Bermuda grass, and those that tend to struggle on the surface tend to struggle mightily. A lot of that comes down to the learning curve with the grain, and at this type of venue, it's going to be much more grainy than we're used to seeing, could be even more so important there. So going to be my number one key stat for this week, but not all that I'm looking at. And number two, we're going to have shots gained approach, which could be argued that is just as important, if not more important, than the shots gained putting on Bermuda. Because we're going to have plenty of layups off the tee, you might have some mid irons, long irons on a few holes, but you're also going to have a ton of wedges. So like we were talking about before, this shots gained approach stat needs to be catered for almost every single golfer. For some of the longer hitters on tour, we're going to be emphasizing that wedge range, maybe that 120, 150 range a little bit more than we would most weeks. And of course, for some of these guys that only get it out there 290 to 300 yards, we're going to be emphasizing that 150 to 175 range a little bit more than we would with some of those bomber type players. I think that's an important thing to emphasize this week, just because this golf course plays so differently based on the decisions you make off of the tee. A guy like Bryson DeChambeau, while he has that elite distance, if he decides to lay up off almost every single tee, he's still going to have pitching wedge into these greens. So that's why I was wishing that we'd have him here this week. Because of his distance, he really would have had a lot of interesting decisions to make, but maybe we'll get that next year around for Waialae. That would be a cool experience. At number 3, we have shots gained around the green, which might surprise a lot of you out there, but a lot of this comes down to correlation. Because we've seen a lot of shorter hitters win at this track, and if we just do a pure correlation analysis of our results here over the last 5 years, the most correlated stat is shots gained around the green. Now, if we take that to a little bit of a larger sample size, shots gained putting does pass up shots gained around the green, but of late, we have seen a lot of emphasis there, and really a lot of that just comes down to the strategy in play here. Because we have so many holes you can lay up on, because some of the shorter hitters on tour have had so much success here, I don't think it should be surprising that around the green is popping in correlations. Typically, the shorter hitters on tour have to make up their strokes somewhere, and usually it's around the green. It's a trend that we see from time to time. So again, not necessarily sure that I'm surprised to see that. Something to mention as well, you guys saw a ton of bunkers in play. You saw 3 to 4 in almost every single hole. So there's going to be an extra emphasis on sand saves this week. In terms of some of the extra key stats I'm looking at, first and foremost, par 4 scoring, which shouldn't be surprising at this type of track. I mean, we've got 12 par 4s. So obviously going to be slightly more important. Driving accuracy, something I'm looking at as well. Not necessarily as important as some of these other stats though, because the fairways here are hard to hit and begin with. We're also dealing with relatively easy to hit out of rough. So driving accuracy has been slightly correlated to success here over the years, but not something I'm really hammering home on. And finally, lastly, we have 3-putt avoidance. Anytime we have these resort style greens, making sure that you guys are going out there, not making bogeys in some of these birdie holes is going to be very important. The first comp course I'm taking a look at this week for Waialae is going to be Port Royal Golf Club, the home of the Bermuda Championship. They're also dealing with a relatively short track. It is a par 71 rather than a par 70, but you deal with tons of tropical windy conditions. It's got a grainy Bermuda grass surface, which is actually unique on its own. Here at Hawaii, maybe the second most grainiest surfaces behind those. So really like it, especially the difficulty level as well. You see a winning score, any from right around 24, 25 under par, the whole way down to just 11 or 12 under par. Just comes down to the weather, much like what we'll see this week at Waialae. Next up, we have the Seaside course at Sea Island. It checks a lot more boxes than even Port Royal does, except not the difficulty. In terms of the setup, you have a short Bermuda grass par 70, is a coastal golf course, and also brings a lot of wind into play. In terms of our number 3 comp course, we have Waialae Country Club, which is home of the Zozo Championship. It is a short Bermuda grass par 70, similar looks off the tee, especially with some of the tree-lined fairways. Like I said before, kind of rare to get a coastal course where we have so many trees in play. Just the unique ecosystem of Hawaii, some of the really rich soil they have there with some of the volcanic rock are actually able to have some of these large trees right along the coastline, which you're not going to see in South Florida, that kind of thing. We can see more shrubs, that kind of stuff. But they're actually able to sustain large trees, which makes the golf course a little bit unique there. And it is what we saw over there for the Zozo Championship. Narashino, also, you're dealing with a semi-tropical climate, right? When you're over there in Japan, it has very similar humidity. You're also dealing with similar temperatures at this type of year. So it is my 3rd comp course for this week. A couple other golf courses you might want to consider as comps that I have seen thrown around the industry. First and foremost, Sedgefield Country Club, the home of the Wyndham Championship. Relatively short Bermuda grass course, par 70. Though you do have a lot more trees in play at the Wyndham Championship, it is a relatively good comp course, so I could see it. I'll be using it as at least a little bit of a corollary for my analysis. And lastly, we also have Mayakoba, which is held at El Camaleon Golf Club. That venue also in the tropical part of the world. You're dealing with coastal conditions, though it does have pass palm greens. I could see it from the setup, right? Relatively short golf course, though there is a lot more trouble in play at an El Camaleon, and you're also dealing with much larger fairways. So I get it from the tropical sense, I get it from the wind sense, but those two aren't my favorite comp courses, but I could go ahead and see them if you wanted to use them for your analysis. That's all I've got for this week's preview. Make sure you guys subscribe to the YouTube channel here so you guys don't miss any of our course breakdowns going forward. We post one of these for every single PGA Tour stop to get you guys prepared for every week's event. We're also getting really close to the 500 subscriber mark, so by hitting that subscribe button, getting us a little bit closer to that milestone, which would mean all that much to me. In the comments, I also want you guys to go ahead and let me know what you think the winning score is going to be this week. With some easy conditions, some benign weather in the forecast, I do expect this to be a birdie fest, something close to 22 under par. But I love hearing from you guys. Go ahead and let me know what you guys are thinking down in the comments. Also, if you haven't already liked the video, make sure you guys go ahead and do that as well. That'll help us out big time with growing the channel and also lets us know that you enjoy the content that is being published. I'm super excited to finally have a full field event back on the PGA Tour schedule. Let's have a great week, guys. If you guys are looking for fantasy golf content, betting content, make sure to stay tuned to the channel as well. We'll have you covered for our Draftkings picks, our betting card, all that sort of fun stuff. Good luck with any bets, any fantasy lineups that you guys are entering for this week. And I'll see you guys next time for next week's course breakdown.